Dr. Ruth Goldstein is an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at UW-Madison. Her current book project, Life and Traffic, Women, Plants, and Gold Along the Interoceanic Highway, examines the socio-environmental consequences of transnational infrastructure projects and climate change in Latin America, with a particular focus on the intersections of race, women's health, and earth rights in Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Goldstein to the stage.
Good late morning to everyone. It is wonderful to be here today, and thank you to Bob Sylvester for the invitation to come and present some of my work in conjunction with Richard Moss's incredible exhibit and very, very powerful film. Before I begin, I realized that I gave credit to my colleague Dado Galdieri, who, if you check out his work online, an incredibly talented Brazilian photographer who was kind enough to give me the top two for you left images. And the bottom three are mine. I forgot to say that. So in case you have questions, I'm really good at citing other people and sometimes forget myself. Oh, there I am. I just had it staggered. Okay, so there you go. Bottom three images, Ruth Goldstein. So I'm trained as an anthropologist, and I'm going to talk about this map in a moment. My discipline, anthropology, tends to read its papers, and I'm not going to just read my paper from the page. I'm going to try and be a little bit more interactive, but you will see me read some passages that I didn't memorize working on my TED Talk for this. And then, of course, trying to leave lots of time for an engaged Q&A, because that's really where I'm sort of most interested to land. So my talk today, and here I go off reading, my talk today will complement the images that you experience in Moss's work, elaborating in different ways on what Moss calls the human scale of building new roads and extracting natural resources in the world's largest rainforest. I'm going to elaborate on gendered metaphors of Mother Earth and how this I see as affecting both conservation and natural resource extraction in the Amazon, an area of the world dubbed the lungs of the earth for its carbon sequestering abilities. Giving historical background to the ongoing deforestation, forest fires, an increase in violence tied to gold mining in the Brazilian Amazon, as well as just across the border in Peru, one begins to see the entangled global economies that contribute to the violence of natural resource extraction. These extractive industries affect indigenous Amazonians the most, polluting the environment, dispossessing indigenous peoples from their land, and contributing to ongoing genocide. And so if you haven't had a chance to see the film upstairs, I think it really gives powerful imagery to the words I just spoke. Natural resource extraction, of course, requires roads to transport people and goods, so that infrastructure is tantamount. In the ensuing creation of man camps to build roads, fell trees, extract gas, oil, and minerals of many sorts, the companion industry of the sex trade follows. I'm not going to focus as much on the sex trade today, but that's very much part of my book, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. While painting a concerning picture, this talk will highlight the voices and actions of indigenous colleagues, both in Brazil and Peru, who fight to protect tribes living in voluntary isolation or situations of initial contact. And I'll break open that long term and definition in a moment. Indigenous women emerge as formidable voices in the struggle to protect the environment and their communities. All right, so I'm going to focus on the Interoceanic Highway today and this triple frontier region among Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia. This is south of where you see Richard Moss doing his work. So the Yanomami are across the borders of Brazil and Venezuela, and then similarly, these are arbitrary borders constructed by global powers, colonial powers. And similarly here, you see many different tribes, peoples who live across these borders and have to often juggle different national laws. So this is an area that I've been working in since 2011. And I've gone back and forth for the past, 14 years, 26 months of field work, and then I also just go back to see friends. I also write grants and work to try and bring Indigenous colleagues to international fora, so to COP29, the climate conference, the MMoCA Convention on Mercury, so that their voices can be heard there, particularly in Brazil and Peru, when you have a leader and a government that is not willing to hear you or is bent on destruction, the international community is really important. So it is in this triple border region where the Interoceanic Highway, which I'm going to talk about today, officially opened in July 2011. This is a highway that continues to be in various forms of construction, and you'll also see deconstruction or deterioration. I was here in this triple border region when the initial inauguration in July 2011 occurred. And this highway is really the basis for my book. And here you can see the highway. It starts in Sao Paulo on the Brazilian Atlantic coast, and it runs sheer across the continent to Peru's Atlantic. And the part in yellow that you see is a section that was previously, there was no paved thoroughfare at all. On the Brazilian side, there had been some of these roads, not all of them paved. And this actually started before the Brazilian dictatorship in 1964. So I want to talk a little bit about unpacking some of the ways in which roads are not just kind of a controlling measure by governments or a Brazilian kind of military dictatorship or a Bolsonaro kind of president, but they are often used by more progressive or left-wing leadership as well, promising economic opportunity, which a lot of people welcome, but are not always informed about the other kinds of drawbacks that could occur. All right, so that's a brief overview. Let's dive in. I'm going to bring you onto the Interoceanic Highway. It's the last day in August 2011, and the clouds hang low in Peru's mineral-rich Amazonian region of Madre de Dios as the truck that I'm riding in speeds along the Interoceanic Highway. I'm traveling with 4 environmental engineers employed by the Peruvian government's Department of Energy, Mines, and Hydrocarbons. Madre de Dios, bordered by Brazil and Bolivia, has been experiencing a gold rush, and with it, the companion industry of the sex trade. So these are just some of the images that flashed by on the side of the road. As we drive, makeshift restaurants and prosti bars or brothel bars flash by. Our destination is a gold mining camp where we will conduct workshops on environmental impacts. On other occasions, I also go into the mines with the health team, different colleagues who we would distribute condoms. We talk about sexual health and sexually transmitted infections. You can see there are some really well-stocked pharmacies. These are makeshift mining camps in many ways, but people also tend to make home, very much a home for themselves. We also ran rapid HIV/AIDS tests and tuberculosis. Unlike the area where you have in Moss's film where the Yanomami are losing their health posts because the miners are intimidating the health workers, this was an area where the health workers were very, very much welcomed. But it is a mining camp. So part of the trick seems to be also servicing the miners. But that doesn't work if indigenous Amazonians don't want them there. This triple border Amazonian region bears the acronym MAP, M for Madre de Dios, A for Acre in Brazil's Amazonian region, and P for a region in Bolivia called Pando. The engineers joke that this remote zone is off the map, home to tribes living in voluntary isolation. Yet despite this off-the-beaten-track reputation, my Peruvian and Brazilian colleagues repeat something I've heard frequently since crossing into Peru from Brazil along the Interoceanic Highway. All the labor trafficking, all the mines, the sex trafficking, wildlife trafficking, and gold, Enrique, one of the engineers, asks rhetorically. His companions nodding in assent, another engineer adds, it's all because of the highway. So the highway forms part of an infrastructure development project to build roads across South America. This began in the year 2000 and it continues to this day. Coast to coast, it's about 3,500 miles. It is Latin America's longest latitudinal thoroughfare, integral for opening Amazonian areas to economic development, transporting goods like Brazilian soybeans. That was initially the sort of justification for building through, quote, virgin rainforest through Peru. And this was a time in around 2010 where Brazil had surpassed the United States as China's top trading partner. So there's this huge push to get Brazilian products to the Pacific coast and reach Asian markets, and vice versa, to transport goods from Asia to Brazil. So the other image that you see here this is from a recent 2024 article on the ongoing cross-border coordination that my colleagues are involved with to try and protect people living in voluntary isolation or situations of initial contact. That image itself, however, is from 2012, and it's just kind of iconic about the push of the new roads and the fanning out of unofficial roads, the gold mining, the logging, the cocaine trafficking started to push these peoples into more of the public eye, out of the forest and into the public eye. So despite all these promises and ideas about what was going to happen about this interoceanic highway and the possibilities for it, what I saw was that the highway was often not very busy. Instead, there was a lot of local traffic, a lot of gasoline, trucks, and I'll talk about in a moment, because I mixed my slides up. So gasoline trucks like this is a combustible, or the nickname, something that explodes, explosive. And you'll see some of the local traffic here. There are people perched atop this gasoline truck. It's obviously very dangerous and entirely illegal to travel this way, but it's free. You have sometimes llamas, alpacas, sheep, various chickens. There's a motor taxi up here. So if you ever traveled in maybe Southeast Asia or Thailand, like a tuk-tuk, so this is a motorcycle with a little kind of cab attached to the back, all riding up here. And this is a pass that's about almost 5,000 meters, so close to 16,000 feet. And then the road descends into the rainforest. So Andes to the Amazon. So coming back to the PSC, this is an acronym in Brazilian Portuguese, and it simply refers to the protection of indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation or initial contact. And these people are understood to be the descendants of folks who either escaped from the rubber barons during the multiple waves of rubber extraction in this part of the Amazon, or they completely avoided the rubber tappers. But there's this sort of ongoing investigation into, through the language of what happened with these people, because there's very much, of course, a fear of encountering so-called modernity. There's also a very deep commitment on the part of my colleagues to protect these folks because they really see them as their brothers, and the whole point is to not ever see them. So it's a really interesting flip for an anthropologist in terms of talking with people, learning their stories, trying to amplify them. The goal here is to never meet them, never talk with them. All right, so there was a lot of buildup for the Interoceanic Highway, a lot of promises about what the highway would bring. The 3 slides with the different road signs, these are in Peru, and they're promises of desolation to optimism, abandonment, or to no longer forgotten, uncertainty to certainty. And you can see that these are now starting to fall apart. On the Brazilian side, after President Lula left office after his first term, the Brazilian economy started to slide. And so this meme started to circulate among my colleagues in Brazil. You have the moon, a lua, Mars, Machi, and Rio Branco, which is the capital of Brazil's state of Acre. So the kind of equal amounts of craterousness or holes, which is to say economic opportunity was not happening here. And the highway itself then became a kind of reflection of what the economic state of each of the countries were. So there are different effects of building these highways and roads for different people. And even for people who are not trying to avoid economic supply chains, the highway has not achieved its promised transnational economic integration. Rather, informal markets and deforestation proliferate. The local traffic driven by the global economic demand for raw materials is quite destructive. Numerous studies, many of them specific to the Brazilian Amazon in this area. I think I'm losing my mic here. I don't want to shrink. Numerous studies in this particular area show that most of the deforestation occurs within 7 kilometers or 3.5 miles of a road. And so once you have this kind of paved highway and thoroughfare, the effect has been not just that kind of deforestation that allows people to enter the area, but then other unofficial roads also begin. So it just becomes this cascading effect of deforestation, and this is what is infringing upon people living in voluntary isolation or situations of initial contact. So the construction of the highway in this triple border frontier zone coincided with the 2008 global economic crisis, further heightening the demand for gold. The newest and most trafficked section, completed in 2011, cuts through Peru's Amazonian Madre de Dios and Brazil's Acre. And this particular triple frontier region did not have any paved thoroughfare. And particular to Madre de Dios, this is an area about the size of Portugal. So just imagine for a moment there was no paved road through this area. So the effect of even just one is incredible. So there was a lot of pushback, of course, from environmentalists, activists, indigenous peoples, but the framing in the Western media and scholarship was that this virgin rainforest was going to be demolished. And I want to, as a gender and women's studies professor, want to talk about some of the work that this gendering does, because this is not a male virgin. This is a very feminized virgin idea of a feminized nature. And here I want to emphasize how for some people, Mother Earth is a powerful metaphor for a life-giving organism, while for others, the gender of the earth can invite disrespect. Virgin land is considered valuable, possibly pregnant with possibility, while land that has been reproducing or mothering, if you will, at least in a farming context, tends to be in danger of depletion. So it's barren, it's infertile, it's disabled in that kind of way. One of the ways I try and frame my research for folks is thinking about would it change if it was Father Earth? Would Father Earth also have pipelines penetrating his body? Or why do we have to gender the earth at all? Would that change sort of the conceptualization of use value or penetrability if we did that? So this is a question about gendered ecologies. Nature is often spoken about as a feminine space that man, capital M, explores and conquers. Sometimes a feminized nature invites respect, other times violation. And as an anthropologist thinking about these different values and oscillating ways of thinking about feminized bodies, human and non-human, something that I see take shape differently across varying cultural perspectives has to do with how we care for or value the land. And now I don't want to flatten indigenous perspectives around the world, but generally a Mother Earth conceptualization is to be loved, to be cared for, is in fact a non-human kin and family member. In a more US or capitalist perspective, she's simply a resource to be used. So this is in terms of a bit of a zoom out for a moment, but thinking about sort of what role do we play, or I'll focus on my own sort of complicity, because I did not know before I started this research the degree to which the gold in my computer, my iPhone, which I have up here, and Apple is famous for not having a very transparent supply chain. This is a global zoom out of all the minerals and mobile devices. But a couple of years ago, the Times did a really fantastic short segment, how tainted gold may have ended up in your phone. And so there are folks who are trying to track from this particular region of Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia, how much gold is being trafficked out of the region and ending up in the electronic devices that we unwittingly buy. So there's a way in which we too can sort of play a part in this. And I joke with some of the classes that I teach that, extra credit for folks who want to call Sprint or Verizon or AT, whoever your cell phone provider is, and say, I'm really curious to know, can you tell me where the gold or the minerals in my phone come from? Obviously, the representative on the phone is like, I'm sorry, I just can offer you the specials today or let you know what your balance is. But I think if we have a little bit more of a focus on this, it can be really powerful. And I don't think I have enough time to play any of this segment, but it's a really fascinating reportage on sort of particularly Amazonian gold and what some of the social repercussions are, in addition to what you see Moss giving us. So I focus on the interoceanic highway because it highlights the ways in which infrastructure projects can facilitate myriad forms of trafficking, reorienting configurations of gendered economies, kinship care, and health for humans and non-humans, particularly in places like the MAP region, where before the interoceanic highway, no paved thoroughfare existed. We also have an interesting Wisconsin connection because this is an area of the world that Aldo Leopold held quite dear. But it's about time that I turn it over to some of my Indigenous women colleagues. This is Francisca Arara. The highway has brought so much destruction, she tells me in April 2011, as we sit in the Pro-Indian Commission headquarters in Acre, Brazil. So this is the first time I met Francisca. At the time, she was studying for a master's degree in agroecology, the first woman in her community to pursue such a degree. And I don't know if folks in the back can see the fine print here, but this is Francisca just this past year at the COP29, the climate conferences. And she is now the State Secretary of Indigenous Peoples in Acre, it's a new position that's been created. It's incredibly excited to have a woman be one of the first leaders in this position. So she's continued to be a really strong voice against deforestation and the effects of what roads do. So the Pro-Indian Commission, in concert with local university and staff professors, has continued to make incredible strides in strengthening Indigenous political resistance. And Francisca has been at the forefront of this movement because she bridges both communities. When I first met Arara in 2011, a multi-ethnic Indigenous leadership had gathered to discuss resisting a possible extension to the interoceanic highway. Francisca and her colleagues worry that the highway extension will bring traffickers and loggers and with them disease and violence. And the Arara homelands, so Arara is both Francisca's last name and her ethnic community. The Arara homelands were one of the first ones where European contact was made, incredibly rich in rubber trees and resources. So they were among the first who were targeted. And because this first wave of initial contact constituted the first blow to Indigenous peoples in the MAP region, she believes that the interoceanic highway has contributed to further deforestation of Arara foodways and language. She tells me it's always about control of territory and natural resources, and the new portion of the highway will be no different. And she talks about the coherillas, the raids, the rubber, and now the drug trafficking and oil extraction. These are all part of Acre today. The raids that Francisca talks about occurred during the late 1800s, the first part of the 1900s, and then again during World War II when there was a demand for Brazilian rubber. These rubber tappers were sponsored by the rubber barons and served multiple objectives by going on these Indigenous raids. Getting rid of pesky Indigenous people who might not want to work or would kill rubber tappers, but also to provide women. They would kidnap women for these single working migrant men. And there's a really fascinating rubber history to this part, particularly to this part of Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia, but I don't have time for that today. For Francisca, the raids during the rubber era did more than eliminate the threat of Indigenous attacks on rubber tackers. Killing or enslaving Indigenous men and taking Indigenous women as wives allowed the rubber industry to expand the territory and control Indigenous peoples' reproduction. Francisca believes that controlling women represents a way to control the language, the culture, and the memories of a people. We've seen this before, as Francisca's point, the creation of road and river infrastructure, the extraction of natural resources, and the erasure of Indigenous life. She thinks of it as a form of robbery, to claim modernity through infrastructure developments that take away more than it gives to Amazonian natives. What makes the interoceanic highway and its possible extension so upsetting is that it further endangers tribes in living in voluntary isolation or initial contact. So Arara has been at the forefront of this push, and it's been especially exciting to see her continued ride to political prominence. She's the matriarch, if you will, of coalition building and resistance in this part of Brazil. But as you see here, she's also taking her message around the globe. So what is it about roads that governments think is such a good idea? Of course, the context and the geography really matters here. Roads can connect people, but they can also divide them. Roads have long captured the U.S. imagination, sort of this idea of being on the road for the U.S. in particular as like a rite of passage of getting one's driver's license, of one's first car. Roads equal freedom, largely in a U.S. mass media kind of imagination. But this is very much a U.S.-centered mythology, one that has been transported around the world to justify the destruction of ecological spaces, which many indigenous peoples call their homelands, or in more recent history, building infrastructure through neighborhoods of color in the United States. So roads can create economic possibility for some, but it can destroy others. This is my quick Aldo Leopold shout out. If you haven't read this book of essays, they're quite lovely. The River of the Mother of God is, of course, Madre de Dios, or the Mother of God in Spanish. The advent of roads throughout Latin America has its echoes, of course, in the North American legacy of the dispossession of indigenous peoples and the importation of African labor, followed by Chinese and Japanese road workers. In this particular area of the world, the map region was something, the building of roads was something that North American conservationist Aldo Leopold deeply feared. And he would speak about the, quote, so-called good roads movement that he saw as so destructive. And this particular area he was worried about because he really thought that Madre de Dios in particular, but this entire Triple Frontier region really was emblematic for him as the unknown spaces, the most virgin wilderness in the world. And he focused on the River of God, and the history here of the river's Spanish name has many origin stories, but what is most telling about the European contact names was that the river used to be called Amaramayu, which means serpent river in Quechua. The name attests not only to the reach of the Incan Empire, which archaeological evidence of trading outposts between Amazonians and the Inca demonstrate, but also a really different kind of relationship with snakes. So for the Quechua Aymara, as well as Shipibo and other indigenous Amerindians, snakes are protectors. They're the snake that wraps around the world. So it's a very different kind of relationship with a serpent, and a very different relationship with a kind of Eve figure. Neither one are to be blamed. They're part of who constitutes the world and the bearers of knowledge, if not also reproductive possibility. So thinking about the work that feminized virgin land metaphors do and how it impacts on conservation efforts today, I wanted to give a brief example before I turn to my final colleague, indigenous colleague, who is also a land protector. In the summer of 2019, wildfires raged throughout the Brazilian Amazon. With 60% of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, the country attracted most of the international media. Global concern, mixed with increased disgust, rose when Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro vehemently refused European foreign aid to stem the damage to the rainforest. And he defended his position during some government festivities, saying, "Brazil is a virgin that every foreign pervert wants," you fill in the blank. In Bolsonaro's view, the European governments saw Brazil as the Amazon and were using the offer to send support to fight the wildfires to lay claim over the land. So to some, Bolsonaro's reasoning smacked of this kind of like fairy tale-esque, the white knight coming in and getting the virgin princess as the prize. But in reality, Brazil's Amazon in many ways did constitute this fair virgin, at least according to Bolsonaro. When the proverbial knights ride in on their white horses, they win the virgin land as their prize. This wasn't actually entirely unfounded. This is quite common for how foreign governments or companies, they offer to say, get the miners off the land, to kick out the loggers, but in exchange for extraction rights in that same area. So one of the incredibly inspiring indigenous women that I want to conclude with, well, Bolsonaro is Wana Payaba, a Shipiba indigenous leader. Well, Bolsonaro blustered his way through gendered ecological references, offending more than just the international community. Indigenous Amazonian women were hard at work centering the rampant deforestation and calling attention to the destruction that mining, logging, and roads caused. So I'm closing my talk here with Shipibo indigenous leader Wana Payaba Kachike. Payaba served twice as the president of her community, during which she referenced the kind of the rape of the land, the not just of the women, but also of the deforestation and other resources that were happening. You see her holding out a lot of castaña or Brazil nuts. And one of the things that she did to try and provide alternative economic possibilities was to build this Brazil nut processing factory after charging miners and loggers a toll for using the unofficial road that they built off of the interoceanic highway. The loggers and the miners took her to court for building this and now rebuilt Brazil nut processing plant, but for illegally charging them a toll to come onto her land. So yes, of course, there's a lot of corruption and the odds were stacked against her. But she videotaped the police tearing down the community buildings that she had funded with the toll money. And she's continued to fight back. She got the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to take her case, and she won that case in 2016. And back in 2021, she was busily having Brazil nuts sent around the world and supporting her community. But for good reason, Payaba remains cautious. She knows that her community battles and the larger struggles to protect their land from natural resource extraction is not easily won. But she reminds me how many people's worlds have ended since European colonialism in Latin America. She knows she cannot halt the mining or logging in her community or change the world economy. She simply hopes to shift the dynamics. Even if we know we won't win, we still fight back. So despite these intimidating challenges, Payaba, like Arara, they are these indigenous women leaders who choose their battles but continue to fight. Though Juana is not motivated by a belief that a new world hovers on the horizon, she can't or won't sell out the forest that is her home. In a quickly heating world, she can't comprehend why more people don't see that we all share this planet and that our fates are interconnected. As Aldo Leopold predicted, neither the river nor the region of Madre de Dios have disappeared from the world map. Rather, the interoceanic highway has left a definitive cartographic mark, highlighting the trajectory of human and environmental traffic. While the Amazonian Triple Frontier Zone and the 3,500-mile highway have geographical and political specificity, the growing network of roads characterizes transnational development schemes that sidestep prior consultation with local communities and environmental assessments. And this is my last paragraph. In Amazonia, extractive economies like sexual systems cannot be understood in isolation. If this rainforest, dubbed the lungs of the earth or nature's pharmacy for oxygen-creating, life-sustaining ecosystem effects for the globe, then the ramifications of road building and trafficking in natural resources is planetary. Echoing climate scientists, controlling rising temperatures means confronting the finite relationship for life on a hot earth. Recognizing this or endings of any sort may not produce a reconstructing of global power, but following those like Francisca Arara and Juana Payaba, it supports an ethical impulse to fight back, grounded in the knowledge that even the most distant ecologies affect all our relations. Thank you. Sorry, I ran a couple minutes over maybe.
Oh, that's fine. We still have some time for a Q&A. If anyone has anything they would like to ask, I can run the mic over. I have a question. How did you start studying, or what brought you to the Amazon rainforest?
Yeah, great. If I stand like this, can folks hear me, or do I have to be closer? Okay. So I have Brazilian cousins in Sao Paulo, and I grew up hearing about the military dictatorship and then the great excitement when it ended, and the slew of social justice movements and changes that came about. FUNAI, which is mentioned in the one of Richard Moss's films up there, is the sort of federal protection agency for indigenous peoples, but much like in the United States, was previous to, say, even 1988, was more about eliminating indigenous peoples than it was about protecting them. And it remains very underfunded for that. And I became really interested more in plants like acai, maca, which is more in Peru, ayahuasca, which is a very powerful psychedelic that's drunk by indigenous peoples throughout the Amazon and is very much a kind of a healing synergy of plants. And these plants were all connected to indigenous claims for land. So for example, if ayahuasca was used as a cultural practice, and indigenous peoples could show that it grew in this particular area, they could map homelands through these new cultural patrimony laws that came about after the dictatorship ended, which is kind of unheard of in a United States setting, right? I mean, you can think about like the work of peyote or something in the American Southwest. It would just be unheard of that people could lay claim to land and have political sovereignty through a plant. But that was what got me interested. And as I started to research more about how these plants were coming to Brazilian labs in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, I learned that there was a traffic of women associated with plants that were used as contraceptives. So even ayahuasca or coca or acai, which you might find in Whole Foods here, there are different kinds of effects that can be used that are apart from sort of what's on the label. And so women would often use ayahuasca as a facilitator for contractions. No one ever used that as an abortive, but things like coca and maca also increase circulation, and they could also then contribute to the evacuation of a fetus. So anything that was to help bring on menses or even fertility could also have a countermeasure. So as I started to research these plants, I was told, oh my gosh, you have to look at the Interoceanic Highway. This is a trafficking conduit. And as I did that, I started to learn about the other forms of trafficking and deforestation. So I never meant to have gold mining be part of my project, and it just became that way. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
No, I was just going to comment that there's a lot of parallels between the highways that you're talking about and the Pan American Highway development in Belize down to Costa Rica and such. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer in southern Belize in a Maya village, and we were able to get some help and support from the Indian Law Center that's located here in the United States on issues precisely what you're talking about, which is the loss of culture from the development of highways, and then the energy infrastructure that follows.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is the re-entry of the Maya into the lowlands in Belize to reestablish on what is crown land, unclaimed land, and they're able to do their rich, they recreate. And I was in the village for a couple of years and experienced it, and the takeaway is it can be rebuilt.
That's so
They have the underpinning culture and are that sort of people. The tribalness is the community. And I take great hope that if we just leave them alone, let them have their land back, they will rebuild it.
Yeah. Gosh, that is the hope. I mean, and there's two things that are so interesting about what you said in terms of like just the resonance where you spent time and the way that the Maya were not necessarily excited about having a road and the kind of destruction it can bring, but the hope and possibility that it could bring back. And that is, it's such an interesting conversation depending on who I'm speaking with, because certainly like a particular like upper echelon of Peruvian really hates my research, and they're like, no, the Interoceanic Highway is great. Like, you just don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, have you ever been to the Amazon? I'm like, have you spoken with people? Not everyone feels that same way, and that possibility of rebuilding in this particular area is, folks are like looking at like rewilding and trying to reintroduce, plant and animal species, but it's really, and I didn't go into this deeply in the talk, it's the mercury that's being used in the gold mining, and it just devastates the landscape. And it is so politically charged to say like, oh, some things can grow back, because then a lot of environmental activists are like, no, we need to say it's like completely barren land, to get the funding. And so it falls into this trope of the kind of like virgin whore of, you have to say that like the land here is barren and it's useless to get the money, because this is like the narratives of international funding, because people, yeah, they absolutely want their land back, even if it's sand and it used to be forest.
And I think you have to understand that having the land back, we do not grasp what the indigenous version of land is. It's their tenure is not ownership, deed, I own this. Theirs is a collective.
Yeah.
And land, and that was a big learning curve for me to understand, because I came there as a farmer, owning a farm, still owned it, and then I was thrust into this where no one owned the land, but it still was parsed out on a need basis.
Yeah.
And then you had it as long as you needed it, but then it would transition to another person. And that's so alien to our, version of worth and value and wealth, because it's all founded in land, the ownership of. And that's precisely the problem in many instances, because it takes the individual over the collective, and you get a bad outcome.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting to think here, I'm part of a land dispossession group at the university, and I don't imagine, it would be great if, I don't know if there are Ho-Chunk folks in the audience, but I often wonder about talking about the sort of out there and what it would mean to think seriously about everything you just said, and what sharing the land or land back would look like in the United States, for example. It would, obviously that's my dream, but it is really hard to dismantle that kind of framing of ownership. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, my question is ignorant by comparison.
No.
Well, it follows though with what you're both talking about, and I just found myself wondering about, now that the road is a fait accompli, if what kind of models are being talked about in terms of repair, or if what I really wondered is economic development viewed positively by the oppressed communities that you're talking about, or is it is that just too facile of a way to talk about it?
No, there's no facile way to talk about it. It's so complicated, and I often will defer to indigenous colleagues, especially when we're in the international settings, because it's not like, it is absolutely a collective kind of leadership, but there's also unevenness in terms of, similar to indigenous youth in the US, there are folks who are like, they want to go to the city, or they want to be in Lima, or they want to be in Rio or in Sao Paulo, and they don't want to stay in the villages. And so, my family doesn't all agree with one another, right? Like, why do we assume that they must be this sort of like, everyone has to be in this collective? And some of it is sort of glossing communities who, yes, have like this long-standing cultural practice of working together and seeing the land as kin, but there, of course, are variations in how people relate. And so it has made the conversations around like both who's excited or who's allowed to say they're excited about the road or possibilities of economic integration really charged and painful, as well as like what does life after this look like? How do we rewild, or how do we bring our communities back together? So there's this cross-border coordination between the Pro-Indian Commission in Acre, Brazil, and the Indigenous Federation in Madre de Dios to try and just language restoration that has so much to do with like land restoration. People forget the names for plants and animals, like, yeah, they have a different relationship with the land. So it's been really exciting to see and to bring Indigenous youth to these international meetings to, like, it changes everything for them to experience that like people are listening to them and they want to hear them and that they respect their practices. And I think that is what shifts it, because it's great to bring in like internet and computers and all of these things for communities, but then you know, they're all on like TikTok and what's off in the middle of the Amazon, and there's this weird dissonance to like, it's all about, I think, this informed consent, and I particularly feel my whiteness in those moments because I want to say, like, but wait, I feel like there's this whole foundation that I want them to have before entering into like TikTok, you know, which I just don't want to get on either. So there are folks who wish they could take away the interoceanic highway, and the way they've now focused, like Francis Van Wana, is just to stop any more major roads from being built. And I think there's largely consensus around that. But it's tough. I mean, even it's hard when there becomes that kind of brain drain from the communities, and so that we're trying to like incentivize what it means to stay, but also have these possibilities to engage globally with the international community. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think we are at about time, so I want to just take a moment to thank Dr. Ruth Goldstein one last time for this wonderful talk.